What's up, everybody? This is Ty Marcellus back with another episode of Tyler the Writer. And today we are talking about Spider-Man. Um, Spider-Man Brand New Day, of course, is coming out in theaters next week, or maybe even this week by the time I get this edited and uploaded. But specifically, we are talking about Spider-Man or Sony's adjacent Spider-Man universe and how they could have done better from a writer's perspective, specifically my perspective of what I would do if I was in their shoes and how I would run their universe. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Sony Spider-Man universe, first of all. We talked about this a little bit in the Blade video, but back in the late 90s when Marvel was going bankrupt, they started selling off their characters to a lot of different studios, and Spider-Man and his adjacent characters all went to Sony. And then from there, we got the Sam Raimi films with Tobey Maguire, which are classics, not, perfect films by any means, but great films, very nostalgic in a lot of people's minds. But then we got Andrew Garfield after those films, and a little, you could say, controversial with why we never got a trilogy out of Andrew Garfield, but still pretty good films from his run. And now we are dealing with the Tom Holland era currently. The reason for that, though, why we get Tom Holland in the current era is because Sony right now is doing a kind of hand-holding deal with Marvel, kind of sharing in both the risk and the profits for these movies. And so long as that deal doesn't run out, we'll keep getting Spider-Man in the MCU. But while they were doing that in the background, Sony thought that they could take their, we'll say, villainous characters, Spider-Man's villain roster, and make money by making movies about them. Which brings us to a couple of lessons that were learned through that fiasco. So, the first lesson that Sony should have learned coming out of it is, first of all, there was no anchor being. And Marvel recently has kind of talked about this idea with their multiverse saga that they're kind of going into and almost coming out of as well into the mutant saga. But anchor beings is something that is basically specific to Marvel, but it's a good term. So I'm going to use it here, related term to what we're talking about. But what I'm talking about specifically as an anchor being is that person that you are following, that person that you care about throughout the story, trilogy of movies, however many you get, but someone that ties it all together. And there can be really two anchor beings, both the hero and then this overarching villain like Thanos that kind of ties everything together for the first half, or whatever you want to call it, of the MCU. But that was lacking in Sony's movies. So therefore, there's really no one to lead us into, no big villain to kind of go up against, and no hero to really stick to. So that leads us into the next piece of advice, is that they didn't really lead into anything. There was nothing to get excited for beyond just the announcement of what the next movie was going to be and who that character was. Which kind of leads me into something. Actually, today I was watching a video that talked a lot about superhero fatigue. And I feel like, if superhero fatigue is a real thing, I feel like it's less maybe superhero fatigue and more just like being sick of bad movies. But I feel like a lot of what these studios are relying on is, we're going to make, for example, the recent box office bomb. We're going to make a Supergirl movie and everyone loves Supergirl, so they're going to come out and see it. But rather than just focusing on making an actual good film. So, again, this piece of advice, there's nothing to lead to. They kind of ended up, Sony, making these one off films that didn't tie or connect to anything else that was going on. And second to last, because I actually thought of a different one, or a fourth one, after reading this list too. But second to last piece of advice is that Sony's universe of Spider-Man characters, which I think is close to what they called it, but it's a separate universe that kept trying to reference these other universes, and that ended up becoming a problem. First of all, they were trying to reference too much Spider-Man's established lore. And I understand that when you're making these characters of Spider-Man, adjacency, Spider-Man characters, you have to have the established lore, the backgrounds of those characters. But what I mean specifically is Spider-Man himself, trying to tie on too closely to his lore, the fact that he exists in this universe, trying to reference him at every point. It was just too much, and especially most exemplified in Madam Web, where they did that a lot. But then also just trying to tie themselves to the MCU as well. Any connection that they could make, including the very convoluted Venom leaving a piece of himself in the MCU, which we'll talk about how that could have worked. But all of these things to kind of try to tie to the MCU that they were desperate to be a part of, because it was, of course, making millions and billions of dollars. My last piece of advice that I didn't write down, but we'll talk about anyway as we go through this, is when you are making stories about villains, you run the risk, and what the tendency is really is to make these villains sympathetic. But then you run the risk of, why not just make a superhero movie? So these villains should, of course, have stayed villainous throughout the entire time of these movies, or, this, whatever you want to call it, disconnected, disjointed universe that Sony created. So with those pieces of advice in mind, I've written down, just like my Blade video, what my idea would have been to create this Sony universe of villainous films connected to Spider-Man. And one of the first things, specifically, just to kind of build hype for what we're going to talk about here, is we talked about our anchor being. And I think the most obvious anchor being that you probably already guessed was Venom. Not only were Venom's films the more successful of Sony's run, but Venom himself is a villain that turns anti-hero, and even in more recent comics, just a full-on hero as well. So Venom was clearly your anchor being, but what Sony has been trying to do for years, and I'm very surprised that they didn't continue to try to do this, is they've always wanted to build up to this Sinister Six film, a film where Spider-Man fights his greatest foes in this team up of six members, which the members have kind of changed depending on which comic you read and which writer takes it. But essentially, what we would build up to then in this case for Venom as our anchor being is a kind of Sinister Six for Venom. So we'll talk about this, but like I said, here is my idea for all of the films, most of them being the exact same film Sony released anyway, but the films and how I would write them and how this universe would go. So we start with Venom. In our first movie, Venom, everything is largely the same. However, we are going to really hammer in on introducing the concept of Venom coming from this planet, the Clintar people, beings, whatever you want to call them, and the idea of Null, who used to rule the planet but is now trapped inside the center of the planet, growing a hatred for all symbiotes that put him there. Which, by the way, when I was making this video, my first take, I kept trying to say symbiote because I said it as a joke, because that's what they did in this first Venom trailer, is they mispronounced that word.
We call them symbiotes. Symbiote.
I'm not sure how that happened, but then once I said it as a joke, I kept almost doing it throughout the whole thing. So hopefully that doesn't happen again, but symbiote is what we are talking about. So everything, though, is largely the same. We still introduce Cletus Cassidy in this as well, kind of like how he's introduced at the end of this film. However, to really hammer in on that idea, Cletus Cassidy will be a murderer, that, serial killer, as he is in the comics, that will kind of be doing things in the background. And even Eddie, being the investigative journalist that he is, will kind of be constantly on his trail. And then maybe even we'll get to see the story that puts him behind bars as well, forming this hatred between the two. But anyway, all of that going on in the background, we have these Clintars who have landed, the total list being Venom, Toxin, Agony, Riot, who is the antagonist of this first film and will continue to be for this version, Sleeper, Scream, and Lasher. So Riot His goal in the first movie, I didn't feel was very well defined what he ultimately wanted. It's also been a while since I've seen it, but for this film, his goal is to be the null of Earth, essentially to rule over it, bring more symbiotes here from the planet, leave null up there, and kind of have this ruling over the planet. So he goes around to kill all of the symbiotes that could challenge him, and he starts with who he would assume to be the weakest one, which we learned in the movie is Venom, because Venom straight up tells us that he's seen as a weakling, kind of an outcast from his society, and so he would attack or fight Riot first. And I kind of also do that on purpose because then that saves the rest of our symbiotes for later in these other films. So Venom and Riot, of course, fight. Like I said, this movie is going to largely be the same. Just I would, you know, hopefully do it better. I don't want to brag, but they fight, and then Venom, of course, wins because of the quick thinking of Eddie Brock and Venom's brains combined, kind of coming up with a solution. Um, Riot dies, as well as Carlton Drake, the person who is being, we'll say, infested or infected, whatever, by the symbiote. But then also, Eddie dies and is reborn through Venom's help. So this kind of sets the stage, the idea that humans who have symbiotic hosts can be revived from death if they're killed, but their symbiote stays alive. However, we'll make it so that the reverse doesn't work. So you would have to kill Venom and then kill Eddie in order to kill them both. So we'll kind of establish that in this first film. So then that brings us right away to Venom 2. Very similar release order here. And Venom 2 is also going to be largely the same with a few slight additions. So first of all, we're going to have Michael Morbius entering the scene before he gets his powers. And Morbius is going to be Cletus Cassidy's doctor. So he's going to come in while Cletus is in jail, and he's going to take a blood sample from him while Cletus already has the Carnage sample or piece inside of him. So this would have to, of course, happen after Eddie goes to visit, and then Cletus bites Eddie, which leads a piece of Venom to kind of come off and become Carnage.
Don't treat my friend again like that! I dare you!
Hey! No touching the inmate! Hey!
I have tasted blood before, my friend, and that is not it.
You know, all of that kind of the same. But then Morbius will end up testing that blood to kind of cure this disease that he's working on. And maybe he saw some kind of report from the jail that, you know, he knew Cletus was his guy for this. And so, of course, we know how Morbius is going to end up. But the reasoning will be because he's kind of combining vampire bat DNA with Carnage DNA, which leads to his own mutation later. So, Eddie is also famous for his report on Drake. Venom is currently fighting crime, so we have our kind of lethal protector going on in this as well. But ultimately, the plot of this movie is a love story, very similar to how it was before. So Cletus Cassidy, Carnage, wants to break himself and his lover Shriek out of jail, very similar to the movie. But one thing I wrote is that they really should have explored more deeply this relationship between Shriek and Carnage, because Shriek's power, being able to scream at these supersonic levels, is one of the weaknesses of these Clintar symbiote beings. And so it's a very interesting dynamic that you have this pair where one is the antithesis to the other. So they really could have explored that more, but we would kind of dive into that as well. Maybe even, and most likely even, having her be some kind of foil, unwilling foil to Cletus in the end. But anyway, they want to get out of jail, so they do get out of jail and start to hunt down their enemies. And Carnage convinces Cletus to make more mini symbiotes in people who can't change back and forth. So these kind of zombified people to do Cletus Cassidy's bidding, forming kind of a cult. And this actually happens in a comic that I think is called The Cult of Carnage. But basically, in this preparation for Null coming to Earth, Carnage does create these zombified human beings. So we'll kind of have him do that as well. But anyway, this kind of helps call out to Null by him doing this. But Carnage wants to kill Eddie specifically to help bring Null here because we'll also learn that Venom and Eddie are the key to releasing Null from his prison. And we'll kind of come up with whatever reasoning we need to make that make sense. I didn't write it here, but we'll make it make sense. So meanwhile, Toxin finds its way into the cop, just like it does in the film again. The cop that shot Shriek, as that backstory goes. I think his name is Mulligan. I can't remember. But anyway, Toxin enters the cop, and so he enters the final fight, bonded with the symbiote. And so we have Toxin and Venom essentially versus Carnage and Shriek. But what's interesting is, when they win the fight, Toxin will nod to Venom as friends, but the cop still hates Eddie and Venom, thinking they're lethal protecting, is making them above the law, skirting the law, all that kind of stuff. But it's another cool dynamic because you have this character who, when they're in a certain form, their alien symbiote form, they love Venom, they're friends, but then when they change back, they want to kill Venom. So interesting thing there. In the post-credit scene, first of all, we would have something where we see these mini symbiotes, these human zombies that Carnage created, still exist around the world, are still a problem to be dealt with by other characters. And then we also see that Null has finally awoken at the end here. So, one more thing too is that the United States hires Sable International, bringing Silver Sable into the story to handle this situation, to help kill some of these zombified people that are now spreading across the world. But I did write one extra note here in the margins where it says if Eddie goes to a different universe like he does during this movie to kind of, again, tie to the MCU, because of the symbiote hive mind, what I think would be really cool is he leaves a piece in the MCU, and then hopefully they would do something with that where, Venom would attach to Spider-Man and kind of run some of those storylines. But let's just say none of that happened the way it actually did in reality. Because of the hive mind, even if he just sees Spider-Man on the TV like he does and doesn't leave a piece, the hive mind of the symbiotes is that they all, share memories. And so it would be interesting then for Venom to come back to his Sony universe now with his Spider-Man logo on his chest, just because he thought it was cool. He likes it. So then we get this more comic book accurate Venom at the end of this movie. But that is the end of our Venom 2, which would then lead us into Morbius. In the Morbius movie, again, largely the same, the origin story of Michael Morbius here. Our doctor uses this symbiote infected blood that he got from Carnage in the previous movie, combines it with some vampire bat DNA, and at first the subject he uses, we'll say it's a bat, seems cured, and so he uses it on himself, but then he becomes a vampire. So Silver Sable, now that she's kind of hunting these creatures around the world, starts to hear about these murders that Michael Morbius has been doing. Because, like I said, everyone in this, other than Venom, is basically going to be a villain. But Morbius can't control himself, so he's killing people to drink their blood. So Sable comes in to take him down. And Morbius's friend, of course, kind of the same storyline, wants this serum as well. But then when Morbius kind of tells him, or maybe he figures it out on his own, what the serum does, how it changed him, rather than him, which I didn't like, I hated this part in the movie, rather than him, desperately wanting it and, making this, I feel like, unjustified villainous turn. Instead, he gets Sable's help, maybe even gets some kind of weaponized armor from Silver Sable, and either together or just by himself, he tries to kill his own friend Morbius. So Morbius, kind of fights these two, where one person will kind of see test audiences or, whatever. This isn't actually happening, but we would in theory. So Morbius fights, he feels regret after killing these two, but we'll say he doesn't kill them. Maybe kills his friend because that'd be sad. But I have Silver Sable coming in later in these movies. But he feels regret, so he kind of runs away to a secluded area, maybe in South America, and he goes into hiding where he then, at the end of this film, develops synthetic blood so that he stops killing people. So this kind of makes Morbius, a little bit more of a heroic character right at the end. But I kind of thought it was always very cheap that Morbius developed synthetic blood early in his career before his disease, and then it was just an instant, oh, I don't have to kill people, I can use this. Um, and again, maybe I'm misremembering that movie because I saw it once and hated it like many people. But anyway, he would make the synthetic blood at the end then to then become more of a hero, maybe even in a post-credit scene. So that's the end of Morbius, simple as that. But then we would move on to Madam Web, which is arguably the worst movie of the series that Sony put out. So therefore, it kind of requires the most legwork for, connecting it into what I have going on here. So in the background of this film, of course, everyone is still prepping for these symbiotes to make their way into their cities, these zombified humans that are kind of existing because of carnage. And so Madam Web, all of this gets set in New York. So all of this, by the way, especially in this film, which, it was for this film in real life too, is a precursor to Peter Parker having been born and operating as Spider-Man. So in New York, no Peter Parker yet. Huge lack of superheroes, in fact. So Madam Web is a researcher with Ezekiel Sims, same villain from the movie, and they're in the Amazon studying different breeds of spiders. And so we see this little Easter egg too that Sony definitely can do, considering they own both franchises, where a spider comes from this hexagonal portal. And the reason for that, for those that don't know, is hexagons is what is used in these Into the Spider-Verse movies to make their portals. So it would kind of be an Easter egg that this spider comes from either one of the animated universes there or just any other universe, because that's just the standard that they've been using for Spider-Man based multiverse hopping. So anyway, the spider comes in, they find this spider, and Madam Web, as kind of a reference Easter egg to Peter Parker being a photographer and she being a scientist, she leans in to take a photo of this spider, and it bites her either directly on the eye, if we want to go with kind of a horrific vibe, or just somewhere near the eyes. And this causes her to go blind, because famously in the comics, Madam Web is blind. And then, well, Ezekiel tries to save her, protect her, to get the spider off of her. He also gets bitten on his hand, and both of them get the power of clairvoyance as well as enhanced, reflexes, strength, all the kind of enhanced skills, your stereotypical superhero stuff. Um, so they don't talk about it because for a while they feel normal. These things don't happen until later. Madam Web, of course, goes to the hospital and all that, but they don't really know each other has these powers now. So she goes to see her friends, which are the Parkers, the parents of Peter Parker, who are pregnant. It's a, announcement party. And at this announcement party, we see Aunt May, Uncle Ben, and then also, who weren't in the actual movie, we see Jonathan Drew and his daughter Jessica, as well as Walter and Lydia Hardy. And Walter specifically is the male version of the Black Cat, who in the comics was operating before Felicia Hardy, his daughter, became the famous, Black Cat. And we can even reference that either they are pregnant or they just recently had a kid as well, to reference Felicia. So a lot of kind of things go on at this party that we won't really talk about. But one of the things that bothered me from the Madam Web film is, again, Sony was reluctant to say Peter Parker's name, even though they made many references to him. So in the film, right before the baby's name is announced, a balloon pops, and then no one ever asks again, like, oh, so what was the name? And they just kind of drop it there.
Ben?
The name is.
Bacon sausage? Richard Jr. Richard wishes. What, seriously? Is this part of the game?
So instead, in this version, before they can announce Peter Parker as the name of their child, Shocker attacks, the villain Shocker. Not that it's a shocking thing, it is shocking, but the villain Shocker attacks. So he attacks on orders from Ezekiel Sims because we learn that Sims, with his new clairvoyant powers, had a vision that baby Parker, Peter Parker, would one day kill him and ruin his whole empire that he's built. So Madam Web, with her new abilities, also fights off this attack. And then, even though she's blind, Shocker eventually gets the upper hand. But then we get this ex machina moment, which basically in film just means out of nowhere, someone saves the day. And it's Jessica Drew, who is Spider Woman. And her origin story in the comics is very complicated. I have a little bit of it later in just a second here, but she's already operating as Spider-Woman, or recently has been operating. So she joins the fight and basically beats Shocker up. So later, Jessica Drew and Madam Web are sharing stories about these powers that they have. And so Madam Web, a kind of loose adaptation of her story from the comics. She says she's from London. Her mom and her were both dying, so dad found this cure in spider venom. Mom chose the daughter because they only had enough for one person, so the mother chose the daughter over her, so she died, which is why she wasn't at the party. And then Jessica Drew enters a coma where she later wakes up having, a few years older, whatever time she was in it, but she wakes up older and then with her powers. And then also her dad then ends up making her Spider-Woman costume for her, giving permission to go fight crime. So that's kind of the general story of how she got her abilities. But while they're talking, they hear of this bank robbery going on. So they both go to stop that crime. Jessica Drew, being Spider Woman, has police scanners in her room and whatever. But while they're there, they almost stop Walter Hardy, who again is the male Black Cat. And they have a little conversation with him that kind of intrigues him enough to like follow them. So then he's always kind of in the background to eventually make his own ex machina moment, come in and save the day. Or maybe they even, try to appeal to his heroic side, but he will come up later. But they almost stop him from robbing the bank, and then he ends up escaping. So Madam Web then goes to work that next Monday and gives this presentation with Ezekiel Sims about their research in the Amazon. And the board says that it's pointless until Madam Web says, hey, these spiders that we were researching could have some special properties and cure certain uncurable diseases. And Ezekiel looks at her with surprise because it kind of tips him off that she must have got powers too, because of the way she's saying, hey, there's more to this we should look into. So the board, asks them for proof and ends the meeting, and that kind of, ends that. But it forms this B plot now of Madam Web needing to prove to the board that this is worth exploring further. But after that meeting, Madam Web and Ezekiel Sims kind of discuss that they both have powers, and she tells him that, trusting him way too much. And she also kind of tells them that they were attacked by Shocker and the Parkers had to move to this apartment complex, not knowing that he's evil. But now she tipped him off so that when he sends Shocker again, he knows that the Parkers are staying at an apartment. So At that apartment, of course, Madam Web is there again with Jessica Drew, just trying to figure out what's going on in this world here. And so both Shocker and Ezekiel Sims show up, and Ezekiel Sims is now in this creepy Spider-Man mask and get up of whatever design. So they all fight, and Parker's even take out guns and other weapons and start to fight back. And this is a reveal from the comics, again, some comics, where the parents of Peter Parker were super spies, and that's why they died and gave him up to Uncle Ben and Aunt May. But they won't mention who their organization is, which kind of leaves it to interpretation, but also could hint that it could be Shield from the MCU. But we won't go that far. So they'll just say we work for a secret organization. So anyway, they all fight, and during the battle, it seems to be lost. But again, like I mentioned earlier, we have the male Black Cat coming in to help save the day. So at this point, Black Cat reveals himself that he was kind of following Madam Web and Jessica Drew, and also following Shocker and just kind of doing some sleuthing. But he reveals that he snuck into Sim's lab and stole proof of him planning to weaponize their research, making super soldiers basically. And then proof of him embezzling money, and then of course proof of him also trying to kill Madam Web and the Parkers, and then also explaining to Shocker why he wants Peter Parker dead. So he reveals all that to them so that they now know that Ezekiel is a bad guy, where meanwhile, Ezekiel Sims recruits another criminal to his team who is Vulture, and a very young Vulture, because as we know, Vulture is an old man when he fights Peter Parker. So all of this happening before Peter, Vulture is still pretty young. But in our final fight, we have Madam Web, Spider-Woman, and Black Cat versus Ezekiel Sims, Shocker, and Vulture. So Black Cat seemingly dies, but dies in this heroic sacrifice, but we find out later that he faked his death. But sorry, spoiler for all of these ideas. But Jessica Drew destroys Shocker's gloves and knocks him out with her Venom Blast, and then Webb knocks out Vulture. And then Webb and Jessica Drew face Ezekiel Sims. And then, like most stories with heroes that don't kill their villains, Ezekiel Sims, his ability or inability to stop his pursuit of progress and pursuit of the Parkers, ends up killing him. So message of this story is that the future is never a sure thing. Madam Web will also now be in a wheelchair from injuries she sustained, again, getting her closer to this comic book accuracy. And then even closer to that, I added that in a post-credit scene, Madam Web can be recruited to oversee time by the Spider Society, such as Miguel O'Hara. It doesn't have to even be Miguel from the Into the Spider-Verse or Beyond the Spider-Verse series. It can be any Spider person from anywhere saying, hey, come oversee our time since you have future seeing powers. But this also functions to get Madam Web out of this story, because she's not necessary. She's not even an action-packed hero that we would want for the rest of this series. So that just kind of gets her out. She's overseeing the timeline now. So that is the end, though, of the Madam Web film that I wrote. So that leads us into our third to last film, I believe, which would be Kraven. And this one, very short, because essentially it's just going to be the origin story of Kraven the Hunter. The biggest thing, though, is keeping in line with him being a villain. He is a bad guy who, as we know, famously from the comics and the movies, is desperate to fight and kill both the most dangerous animals he can find and the rarest as well. So he'll kind of do that with real animals at first, but eventually he'll go on to some of the animal themed characters that are in Spider-Man's roster. So along the way, as we follow Kraven's origin, everything will be largely the same, but he'll kill characters like Vermin, who is a character who was forcibly mutated and exiled, this kind of rodent-based character. And then he'll also have one of the main fights before we get to his main villain of the film will be Rhino, who Clarification was the main villain of the actual Craven film, but he won't be for this because we'll have a more accurate Rhino who is a man that got stuck into a military armored suit that's obviously Rhino themed. And it was the Russian government who got him stuck in this suit, at least in this version. And so he'll be attacking the Russian government, and we'll hear that they already tried to send the character Crimson Dynamo, who's like Russian Iron Man. Maybe we'll even see him. But he failed. So they call Craven up, and Craven has to go take him out, which he successfully does, not without some difficulty, of course. But our main villain, though, is going to be the lizard. And the reason I chose the lizard over the rhino is because, first of all, he actually changes into an animal, kind of like vermin, but the lizard can't control his changes, at least in this version here that I'm writing. So, because of that, he's a sympathetic villain, really, because again, Craven is the villain. But the reason Craven is a villain is because he's killing an innocent man, hunting an innocent man who can't control his turns to this massive lizard character. Um, Another thing, though, is we find out one of the plot twists of this film is Craven's brother Dimitri, who has always been the chameleon, this shape changing or master of disguise, whatever version you subscribe to. But he gave bad drugs to the lizard who was trying to regrow limbs. That's why the lizard does what he does, experiments on himself to regrow limbs. But then we'll say Dimitri gave him some bad stuff that turns him to the lizard. So now he is specifically trying to kill Dimitri. And that's why Craven gets involved, because in his mind, he's just protecting his brother, not knowing that his brother caused his own danger. After all of this stuff, again, pretty simple storyline: killing, fighting. Craven wins, defeats the lizard. Dimitri will seemingly die, kind of fake his own death again, but he'll come back disguised as this powerful government person, and he will now send Craven to kill Venom, leading into the connection here to our anchor character. And so with that, Craven is, he villainously, yeah, there we go. He accepts because not only is Venom a terrestrial animal in a sense, but he's also super dangerous, just what Craven likes to hunt. And then we can also, I added a question mark here, but we can also have Craven upgraded with some kind of technology or maybe even powers through his brother's connections. Again, his brother being disguised as this powerful person. But then I also wrote that Venom will get a team together leading to, or sorry, not Venom, Craven will get a team together leading to Venom's Sinister Six, which will consist of Morbius, Silver Sable, Shocker, and Spider-Woman. And then he'll add some other people as we go. So that will be the end then of Craven the Hunter, which leads us to Venom the Last Dance, our second to last film in what we can consider the first phase of this idea. So, in Venom the Last Dance, we have Eddie back together with his ex, Anne, and now he is a new father with a young boy. Venom is still fighting crime as this, lethal protector, and still going around killing the last of Carnage's, creatures, these zombies that he created. But meanwhile, of course, Craven now enters the scene. So Craven, and maybe, like I said, Craven recruits some other people to help him. So maybe he doesn't recruit them also until later, because I do kind of have a scene for that written in here. But Craven, first hunts Toxin that went into the cop because he knows or figures out that Toxin hates Venom, so he hunts him down to try to get some insight, maybe get some help. So he can't kill Toxin, though, before Toxin ends up releasing all of the symbiotes that the government had captured. And then this, of course, causes Null to send in the xenophages. Now, I feel like I'm confusing you here, so let's restart. Toxin, who's infecting this cop who now has access to this government facility with all these other symbiotes, or maybe he's even just locked in there. In his bid to fight Craven, he releases them all before figuring out that him and Craven can actually work together. So Null, who's now awake to kind of see what's going on with this symbiote, sees this and realizes that, hey, now that these symbiotes are out of the government's protection, I can send the xenophages, which are like symbiote killers, to help unlock him from his planet. Some of this logic comes from the actual Venom the Last Dance movie as well. But the xenophages, anyway, don't show up until the end of the movie, but we know that they are now on the way. So Craven, either kills Toxin or lets him live, maybe for later. But anyway, he then goes to try to kill Venom, but he gets injured. So after a quick recovery, Craven, along with Silver Sable, there was this, you could say dumb line, we'll say dumb line, in the original Venom the Last Dance, where they say, send in the six. And it's a cool line, or it's supposed to be a badass line, but all that happens is six normal humans come in, six elite humans, and they kind of get killed off pretty quickly as well. But instead, in this version, we are going to send in, Venom's Sinister Six. So that will be now Craven, Silver Sable, Morbius, Shocker, Lasher, one of the symbiotes, and then Spider-Woman. And Lasher, by the way, is the symbiote who I believe is infected or bonded to the female scientist in the Venom the Last Dance movie, the one who has the electric power. So same one there. So these six, come in and try to kill Venom, and thinking that if they can kill Venom, these symbiote humans that Carnage made will all just disappear, which obviously they're wrong about. So there's this huge mid-movie fight between Venom and his version of the Sinister Six, and Venom is, during this fight, able to kind of take a break and explain to Spider-Woman that he's good, kind of tells her all that's going to happen. Maybe even he takes her away from this fight for this to happen, or she fights him, takes him away. But anyway, leads into her turn to the good side because she is a heroic character. So she realizes that she accidentally allied with the villains. So we get this kind of final movie team up, gear up scene where everyone prepares for this fight. And so our final fight of the film is going to be Venom and Spider-Woman and whatever symbiotes want to help Venom. Some of the others like Mania and, let's see, who do I have here? Scorn and ZZZXX. I don't know how to pronounce that one, but other symbiotes that would help out. And to replace Venom and Spider-Woman, who have now, well, Venom was always the good guy here, but Spider-Woman, who has now defected, to keep our Sinister Six, we'll have Vulture replace one of them, who we've already established in a different film. And then our new character will be Tombstone, entering this film as well. And Tombstone is basically a gangster, so it's pretty easy just to say Craven goes, offers him some money, he'll do anything for the right amount of money. He's a gangster and wants to make money. So the good guys, of course, win, but the xenophages, of course, arrive and they kill all of the symbiotes, and they're even able to separate Venom from Eddie, and Eddie seemingly dies yet again. But we know with Venom, he can come back to life. So both Eddie's body and Venom are then taken to Null, which ultimately then frees Null from his prison, ending on a cliffhanger there. But in the post-credit scene, Venom creates yet another child who is called Phage, who then attaches itself to Eddie's actual child, his human kid. So now that's going to come later. And those of you that have read the King in Black storyline will kind of have an idea of where this is all going. So leads us to our final movie, which is called The King in Black. So the son of Venom has been learning throughout, we'll say, a year, however long it's been, learning how to control this new symbiote inside of him, use its powers. and now Null has come to Earth with these massive dragons and monsters and all these things. Again, if you read the comic book, all of that kind of stuff. So he starts to also control the symbiotes that Carnage made, and now the world is just absolute chaos. Everything sucks. It's basically the apocalypse. So Phage, Sable, Silver Sable, and Spider Woman are all fighting this scourge that has come to Earth. As kind of the last heroes left. We can even have Easter eggs of like other heroes, Captain America found dead and whatever. But when Null arrives, we also see that he has brought Eddie and Venom back to life, but now they work for him. So they're, final resurrection here. But eventually, in this desperate bid, there's a lot of fighting with Venom and our main characters, our heroes, whatever. But finally, they're able to turn Eddie back to the good side, especially because of seeing his son. So they reason with him, breaks him from Null's control. I wrote here that maybe Silver Sable dies in this attempt, or one of the fights with Venom, she dies. But Eddie back to the good side. So characters then travel around the US trying to hide from Null and also trying to find other symbiotes to kind of form their own army against Null and to save the planet. Specifically, I wrote that they find Scorn, who attaches itself to Anne, who was Eddie's girlfriend. And they find ZZZXX, again, who I don't know how to pronounce. But this symbiote can't speak and never reveals their human form, maybe not at least until the end. But I always thought it'd be funny to have this, non-speaking symbiote be some kind of super famous person revealed at the end. But in the final fight, we have Venom, Phage, Scorn, and ZZZXX, who are all fighting Null and his forces. This huge battle. We also have the return of Black Cat, who again faked his own death. Very, I was going to say slimy, slippery, kind of character, but he comes back in the end. And Spider-Woman reveals that she was given also a piece of a symbiote, becoming the character Mania, and ultimately Phage, being incredibly powerful. Again, that's Eddie's son. Since he was literally born of a symbiote, defeats Null, kind of by himself. So it opens the door too for Venom to either die or exit the story in the next, let's say, phase 2, and then having this more powerful character leading the charge after. But I did write to kind of end this phase 1 here and to end this video that all symbiotes go back to their planet to rebuild and reform. And so even Venom goes back to his planet, leaving Eddie for a while, and then, of course, leaving the door open for Venom to make his way back when he feels like it, or just to never come back. And now his son is our main character, our anchor being. So again, that was my idea for what Sony should have done, or what would have been a really cool way of making this universe with these Spider-Man adjacent characters, keeping all of them villains, except for, of course, Spider-Woman, and Venom being our main character hero, but also an anti-hero as he kills people in his lethal protector status. Definitely an anti-hero there. But yeah, let me know if you liked that. Leave a like on the video, comment anything that you would change, things that maybe you would like explained more or that you would do differently. But yeah, let me know your thoughts also. If you see this video after seeing the new Spider-Man, tell me how you or what you thought of it. Super excited for Spider-Man Brand New Day. It looks to be really good. So let me know. Of course, check out New World Comics. That's NU World Comics on all social media. And we will see you next time.